Hello, everybody. I am recording this message from Colorado Springs. I am currently traveling with the debate team at the University of Utah to a tournament. One of the things that I do as part of my work at the University of Utah is coach the University of Utah's College Speech and Debate program. If that's ever something that interests you, let me know. We are also putting on a public event where our team will debate several British debaters, so that's pretty cool and is coming up next week as well. So feel free to email me about that too if you're interested. Also, please remember that both the midterm as well as your first assignment in the class, the argumentation diagram, are coming up. People have been asking a little bit about the midterm. Again, that will be a digital exam, so you'll take it just like the quizzes. You'll have a week of time in order to complete that exam, and once you start it, you're given a more limited amount of time. I believe it's about 90 minutes or so in order to complete it. So definitely take it at a time in which you feel ready to do it within that limited period of time as well. So it's a multiple choice, true-false matching type exam, so pretty similar to the multiple choice questions that you've seen already in some of the quizzes. So let's get into some of the material in Chapter 5. So Chapter 4 was really important in laying out the Tolman model and the ways the arguments are structured and kind of appear in a variety of different contexts. So we see argument by sign, argument by analogy, and then things like your claims, your warrant, your grounds, and other forms of support for major arguments. When you're thinking about Chapter 5, you can think about this chapter in terms of determining the types of topics that you might argue or debate about. So for instance, in Colorado at this tournament, we debated a lot of different topics. We debated, for instance, lowering the income tax rate in the U.S. We talked about lifting sanctions on Sudan. We talked about the European Union making financial reforms, all sorts of things. And these were various topics and propositions that became the basis for debate. And that's a similar way of thinking about some of the concepts that are discussed in this chapter. So one of the things that the chapter talks about is a proposition. So this is kind of a critical question that appears. So there were examples, for instance, about is global warming caused by humans? Does a solution require a radical change of society? And all sorts of other things. And one of the things you might notice, going back to Chapter 1, is that these questions might take the form of a fact, value, or policy-oriented question. So a fact question is asking whether or not something is true. So like, is the earth flat would be an example of that. A value question is what, like, should we believe, right, in terms of our own values and ethics. So for instance, is it just to have a minimum wage, for example? And then a policy is a specific action. So should we raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour would be an example of that type of proposition. So when you're discovering the proposition, you're determining, what is the main topic or the main question that I'm trying to address. And so trying to identify what is the question you're looking for and how does that fit with what you're wanting to learn about is super important. Also, searching for information is super important. One of the things that I really encourage people to do is do a Google News search, so news.google.com, using the lib.utah.edu, that's the University of Utah's library resources. And we have a bunch of articles and things that you can't find in any other place. Additionally, things like LexisNexis, other library resources that we have. There's also this really cool tool. It's the JSTOR Text Analyzer. I'll give a link to that later, but those are all examples of the ways that you might find additional information on your topics. It might be helpful as you start thinking about what type of topic that you're interested in using for your major assignments in the class. One of the other things that's important to do, and one of the things you'll realize as you start to do that, is some of the different types of arguments that you hear on these topics too. So what are people saying? What is the kind of predominant outlook on this topic? Like, what are economists saying about the minimum wage, for example? And then when you canvass alternative decisions, you're looking at on this question, what are the different approaches that somebody could take on this topic? So do we do a federal minimum wage increase, or do we use the minimum wage and increase the minimum wage on a state-by-state level? Another thing is weighing the costs and the risks. So when you determine some sort of topic or issue, then you're trying to decide, what happens if I go in door number 1 or door number 2? So if we raise the minimum wage, what does that world look like? If we keep the minimum wage as it is, then what will that end up looking like? So when you're determining, like, maybe this is good for the consumers but bad for businesses, or maybe this is great for people but also really good for businesses, right? Like, you're trying to make that calculation either way, and that's one of the ways that you can reach that. And then you kind of go through those stages and then determine what your proposition is. Another thing is kind of determining the issues. So what are the arguments and the main things that kind of emerge there? So the issues in this case would be things such as, what is the impact of the minimum wage on businesses? What is the impact on consumers? Maybe you could make arguments that the minimum wage disproportionately impacts people of color. So there are a variety of different arguments that you could be making on that. You can also, for instance, figure out if something's controversial or an uncontroversial matter. Right? So uncontroversial is something that people generally agree on. So there are a lot of things that not everybody agrees on, but can we say, for instance, that the earth is not flat? Most people could reach that common place, or most people could say having the economy function well is a good thing, although there are certainly people who might disagree with that, right? So that would be uncontroversial. Whereas controversial, right, those are the values and the kind of policy questions that are super contentious. To use another example, like the current issues surrounding healthcare and the most recent Graham-Cassidy iteration of the healthcare bill, there was huge controversy surrounding the aspects of that bill and whether or not those were positive or negative things. So that's an example of that in action 2. And another thing is kind of rank ordering issues. So one of the things that we do on the debate team is when we find out the topic or the issue that we're debating, then we try to figure out, what are some of the major and the most compelling arguments to make on this topic. So that's something that kind of comes up a lot, and so you can determine, which topics have the biggest impact, so which topics and issues affect the most people. Versus, which topics are maybe less important or less talked about. So when you're making arguments on a particular side, you always want to put the strongest arguments first. And obviously, those are the ones that fit best with the decision makers and their own values and beliefs. But they're also the arguments that, might have the biggest and the most important implications. So that's something that's important to think about when you're kind of thinking about the rank order issue. Also, what critical values will be applied? So that's something that the textbook talks about in terms of the way in which you adjust the arguments that you're making depending on the audience, depending on the decision makers, right? So establishing clarity is super important. If you're at a business meeting and you're trying to say that you need to make some sort of change, like to downsize, for example, then you need to be really clear on why that's an important or good thing to do. Additionally, why is this significant? Significance is the so what. Why does it matter? Why does it affect me? You should always try to find a way in which your argument and your support for your argument fits with the values and beliefs that the decision makers have. Show them why they should care. Additionally, the relevance or salience. So this means that the topics that you're finding from your proposition are important or they matter. So if I was talking about the minimum wage and I suddenly started talking about giraffes, then that wouldn't be a relevant topic as well. Additionally, we have inherency. And this is an important and at times complicated concept. But to put it simply, inherency is the barrier that is preventing the action you want to happen from happening. So if I were to say, for example, that we need to repeal and replace healthcare, then I would say the inherency is that Congress has yet to do so. Congress has recently said that they will not have enough votes to do so, etc. So inherency suggests the thing that is preventing what you want from happening. Or you could say that we should value wage equality, and then the inherency is that there is a lack of effort to promote wage equality in the status quo. Status quo being how things are unless you take some sort of action. Additionally, are your arguments consistent? Do they fit together? That's an important idea too, right? Like, do your arguments hang together and fit in the context of what you're saying? So if you were to say that the minimum wage is good, and all of a sudden you made an argument that, like, the minimum wage is bad for business, then that doesn't fit with the arguments that you're trying to make. You can certainly preempt those arguments and be prepared for those arguments, but you probably shouldn't be making them given the side that you're debating. And then when you get to kind of analyzing the claims that are being made, you can think about, what are the claims saying? What are the values? How are these being evaluated? So for instance, if you're some of the examples that are given about like CO2 levels and what should be done on those, right? Like the types of questions that are emerging always bring about certain values and assumptions. Like if there's good support for the claims as well. That's super important too. So one of the things you should look at carefully is the study or the citation that somebody gives. Like, is this a good study? Is this a published study? Is it published at a respectable journal or book, something like that? Like, what was the method in their study? Did they actually sample a good group of people, right? So if I were to say that I would run a survey on the United States, but I only use the state of Utah, then I might be getting a very skewed sample relative to some of the other issues that affect other states. So figuring out, what is the strength of the central arguments that people are making surrounding a topic is extremely important. So when we're thinking about this chapter as a whole, we've thought about what makes for reasonable arguments. We've thought about all of the parts that come together to make an argument. So now we're starting to think about the various topics and issues that get debated on those things. So when you know where the arguments are happening and how you reach developing a particular topic, then we can start to talk about the ways that you effectively build a case on a particular topic. We'll get more into that next week. But for now, I hope you all have a great weekend, and feel free to get in contact with me if you have any questions.